So we would like to look at the first chapter of Daniel to get three keys for understanding the book of Daniel. Daniel wrote more than 500 years before the birth of Christ, and his book contains apocalyptic prophecy. That's prophecy that has a historical continuum down from the prophet's day to the end, whereas classical prophecy has multiple applications and not the historical continuum. This has one application. So in the first four verses, we find the key for explanation, the expletive key, because in the first four verses, it talks about the condition of God's people. It says their kingdom has been destroyed, their king has been dethroned, their sanctuary has been sacked, and their people are taken captive. So in those first four verses, we're given the outline of the book. The book contains 1, 2, 3, 4 prophetic outlines. Chapter 2, chapter 7, chapters 8 and 9, and chapters 10 to 12. In the first outline, we see the restoration of the kingdom. In the second, the restoration of the king. In the third, the restoration of the sanctuary. And in the fourth, the restoration of God's people, like it clearly tells us in Daniel 10:14. So, the keys at the door, the first key, the expletive key in verses 1 to 4, there are four prophecies, and each prophecy has a story that corresponds with it. The story that goes with the kingdom is that of the three Hebrew worthies in the fiery furnace. The story that goes with the king being restored is Nebuchadnezzar, who ate grass and then was restored to his kingdom. That's in chapter 4. In chapter 5, we find a story about the sanctuary. Belshazzar took the articles of the temple of God and used them in his idolatrous feast. Even the candlestick was there, and that's an illustration of the restoration of the sanctuary, because that night Cyrus came in and the kingdom was passed to the Medo-Persians, who decreed the restoration of God's sanctuary. And the fourth prophetic outline about the restoration of the people in chapters 10 to 12 has a story that corresponds with it. That's the story in Daniel 6 about Daniel in the lion's den. God's people are restored from the lion's den. So each of the outlines in the book of Daniel is given us in those first four verses: kingdom, king, sanctuary, and people. The next few verses, from verses 4 to 16, talk about the education, the language, and the names that were given to these four Hebrew youth. They were given Babylonian education, they were given Babylonian names, they were given Babylonian language, and they were given Babylonian food. And their names were changed from Daniel, which means God is judge, to Prince of Baal. Hananiah, which means grace of God, to servant of Aku, the moon god. Mishael, none like God, was changed to none like Aku. And Azariah, which means helped by God, was changed to the servant of Nebo, the mountain god. Why did these young people accept Babylonian education, Babylonian language, and Babylonian names, and not Babylonian diet? This gives us the interpretive key. The key to interpretation is the Bible, and the Bible only. The Bible is its own interpreter. And these young men were trained in the books of Moses, and they knew that in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 9, that Aaron and his sons were to drink no intoxicating beverage. And in chapter 17 of Leviticus, verse 7, God's people were told not to eat meat offered to idols. And in chapter 17, verse 10, it says that they were not to eat anything that contained the blood. And so, Babylonian food, the meat contained the blood, the wine was intoxicating, and the food was offered to idols. So these young men based their rejection of the food on thus saith the Lord. So there is our key for understanding Daniel. We must let Daniel himself explain his symbols, let the Word of God explain them, and we will advance properly without jumping to some history book or some newspaper to understand the meaning. And the third thing we should learn in chapter 1 is the operative key. How does God operate with humanity? And so we had the test in regard to food. They had 10 days of probation, followed by an examination, and given the results, the diet they requested. They had 3 years of study, followed by an appearance before Nebuchadnezzar, an examination, and given the results, they were given positions of high influence in the Babylonian kingdom. And Daniel himself, who served under Nebuchadnezzar and under the kings that followed him, came to that night of crisis at Belshazzar's feast, and in that crisis, that judgment, he came out receiving high position in the Medo-Persian Empire because Darius himself put him as one of 3 presidents and later the sole president under the king. So each of these things illustrate time, test, and results. 10 days, 3 years, 70 years. Time, test, and results. And the book of Daniel is going to show how God operates through a continual history of time, followed by a final examination, a final judgment, an investigative judgment, an examination, and then the results. So, the operative key that we find in chapter 1 has to do with time, test, and results. We could say that in chapter 1 of Daniel, the book deals with time, judgment, and results, showing the restoration of God's kingdom, God's king, God's sanctuary, and God's people. And Daniel is an apocalyptic book. Its prophecies contain a historical continuum from the prophet's day down to the end. And we can only understand Daniel if the Bible and the Bible only is our guide. Thank you.